There is trouble on Union Island. The people of Union Island have only ever known Ashton Lagoon as a pristine place where they fished and recreated since the days that they were born. But then in the 1990s, a marina appeared, or really just half of a marina, whose stony fingers spread across the lagoon, stopping the water flow, causing algae blooms, and killing off the fish. This should never have happened, except for the corrupt dealings of a corrupt government and a corrupt business that mysteriously disappeared in bankruptcy halfway through the project, leaving the island half a marina, and leaving the country a massive scar. And you can imagine if you were the people who were living on that island, that you would be pretty upset. Because like I said, these people and their parents and their grandparents, all the way back to the time the British had brought them from Angola and Cameroon as cotton slaves, had only ever known that lagoon in its best conditions. So when the damage actually came, it made them reflect, made them think as they looked across the lagoon, what can we do to compensate? And then they looked outward to the rest of the Caribbean. And as you might know, many of the Caribbean countries are very successful with mass tourism. But the Union Islanders, they didn't want mass tourism. They were thinking that maybe for our country, and that country is St. Vincent and the Grenadines, maybe for our country, we can find something more permanent, something smaller, something that they call ecotourism. And in fact, Union Island does have quite a number of nice landscapes and some interesting cultural aspects, and now it has an interesting lagoon story. But to get to the benefits that they've heard about, these ecotourism benefits, they need to make a choice. They have to go down one of two paths. Now, one of these paths leads to the benefits of ecotourism. The other side leads to ecotourism failure, which is probably the path that more projects have taken. The problem is, we don't know which path leads to the benefits, and we don't know which path Union Island is going to take. Well, before we discuss which is the path and what's at the other end of the path, let's look at some examples of some places that actually have gone down to ecotourism success. For that, I'm going to take you on a small tour, a couple sites in the Americas and a couple sites in Africa, where we're going to see some examples. Okay, so the first place we're going to go would be the Panama Canal. As many of you may already know, the Panama Canal is a huge canal that allows big cargo ships to come from the Atlantic, Africa, Europe, and to pass right through to the Pacific, so they don't have to go all the way around if they want to go to the United States, West Coast, or they want to go to Asia. Now, to have a canal of this size requires a lot of water. And to have a lot of water, and this has to be clean water, of course, because if the water came with lots of dirt in it, then the canal would fill up and the ships wouldn't be able to go through. So they need to have a lot of clean water, which means they need to have clean forests and rivers feeding into the canal. And in fact, there are such a thing. But to keep them in such good shape, the government of Panama declared national parks around the canal. Now, living in one of these places before the national park was declared was a group of Native American Indians, a tribe called the Embara. And for many decades, they lived fishing, doing agriculture, and hunting in this area not far from the canal. But when they declared it a national park, they had to stop these activities. Now, they could have decided to just fight the government, but that wouldn't have been very advantageous. So they decided on a different strategy, that maybe they would start up and use their village in the rainforest as a cultural ecotourism attraction. And that's what they did. But the Embara did not look like this when they came up with that idea. They wore clothes just like everybody else. They spoke Spanish just like everybody else. So that alone wouldn't make them a terribly interesting place to visit. So what they had to do is, they had to do research. They had to research to find out what their traditional clothes were like, what their traditional dances were like. What was the traditional way of making these thatch roofs? They also had to learn or relearn how to make baskets and how to make jewelry. And then they had to learn, and this probably didn't come from research in their past, they also had to learn different kinds of activities to do with tourists, whether they be hiking or boating or tracking. Had to learn how to feed them local food and put them in the local huts for the night. So they learned all of these things. They didn't do it just by themselves. They did drive the process, but they had the help of the Panama government, they had the help of a tour operator, they had the help of the U.S. government with technical assistance. And today, it's considered a very successful ecotourism project. So now let's go to my country, the United States. Although I don't live in the United States, I actually live right here in Costa Rica. Nonetheless, I visit the States from time to time. And one place that I visited was called Benezet, Pennsylvania. Now this was a very small town of poor people who live in the woods of north central Pennsylvania. There's probably not more than 200 people who live in Benezet. And they have a fairly unique problem, well, unique by American standards. For Africans, you're not going to find this a very unique problem, because you've all heard it. But they have this problem with this very large animal. Well, I guess for Africans, it's not that large either. But for us Americans, it's a big animal. Anyone know what that's called? It's called an elk. And the problem that these people have, you can see one of the houses in the back, is the elk come out of the woods and they walk right up onto the yard and then they start eating their gardens. Now, that's annoying. I mean, it's not as bad as elephants coming up and stampeding your gardens and running over houses. But for Americans, that's pretty annoying. But that's not the worst part, because right behind the elk are tourists. And they're following the elk right up onto the yards just as much, but they're not eating the gardens. They're taking pictures. And they're doing something even worse. They're knocking on the people's doors and asking if they can use their bathrooms. Now that is very annoying. But that's not the only thing tourists do to cause trouble for these people in the woods. On the weekends, they're all driving their cars up and causing traffic congestion. So that people are out in the middle of the woods and they can't even drive out because the roads are clogged up with tourist cars following and watching the elk. So this became quite a problem, and eventually the state of Pennsylvania hired a company called Fermata Inc., a company that I have done some work for, to figure out this problem. This company specializes in tourism planning. So what they did is they came up with the idea of the Elk Scenic Drive. And basically they defined a loop, a couple loops there really, through the forest where the tourists could drive and observe the elk. They identified parking spaces. They put up signage, both educational signage like this, and also directional signage to try and bring some order to the chaos. Not only that, but areas that previously were degraded, for example, or degraded, I don't think degraded is a word. This area here used to be a strip mine for I don't even remember what. And so it was a very damaged location. So they came in and planted plants that the elk like to eat. So they've recovered the area, environmental restoration, and made a very nice viewing location for the elk. So once order was brought to the situation, then the local people would actually know when and where to find tourists, and they were able to offer housing and food, and also add value to the wood carvings that they do. And they, now because this was marketed as the Elk Scenic Drive, anyone who participated in that had a marketing outlet. Where before, no one even knew that the people were there, let alone had housing and food and handicrafts. So the scene is much happier now than it was when it started out. Okay, now let's come back to Africa. We're going to go to the Pinda Private Game Reserve in South Africa. Now there is a large piece of land 11,000 hectares, really, that also is highly degraded, thanks to the walking of cows into growing sisal, and for growing cotton, and growing, I don't know what else, corn maybe? So they bought this 11,000 hectares, they being a company called CC Africa, which is a very large ecotourism company that makes lodges, especially. And now you can have the African experience in an African lodge, even in India, and somewhere in the Americas, because they're expanding around the world. So this 11,000 hectares, but that wasn't the whole game reserve, because then they leased 17,000 more hectares from local communities, and also acquired the rights to go across 23,000 hectares even more. So the communities, even before the project began, were already benefiting from the leasing fees. And then the company brought in high-quality land management, restocked 2,000 animals, including the big five, of course. And now we find that in the reserve there's 7 lodges, 2 of which are owned by the community. I'm kind of doubting this is one of the ones owned by the community. And because the company is so successful, they actually started a foundation called the Africa Foundation, whose mission is to work with communities around the protected areas where the company works to help them out in development aspects. So different things that they do, they offer scholarships, and they build clinics, and they build schools. They allow access to the local people for reeds and different building materials, scholarships as well. The company employs nearly 200 people in the area and purchases almost 50% of everything that it buys from a 50-kilometer radius. So that means most of it is purchased quite locally, which means more of the money stays in the area. So now I'm going to bring you to one more site in Africa, and this would be in Madagascar, in the village of Andovovadoaka. I've tried to say this about a dozen times and I still can't quite pronounce it, but I guess you can read it, so I don't need to say it correctly. In any event, so this is a fishing village on the southeast coast of Madagascar, as you can see right there. And there's an organization, a non-profit called Blue Ventures. And what Blue Ventures has done is they built a scientific research station somewhere right over here, where real scientists do real research on the coral reefs and on different kinds of marine organisms. Now, why this is ecotourism related is because Blue Ventures brings in volunteers, they're not scientists, but volunteers to work alongside the real scientists collecting real data and real investigations. Now, of course, they call them volunteers, but they're really tourists because they're paying a good amount of money to have this experience. Now, these tourists, or volunteers, they go into the village of Andovovadoaka, and the villagers are responsible for their food, for their housing, for their entertainment, for their cultural activities. And the villagers not only do those things, but they're also hired by Blue Ventures to be tour guides, to be dive masters. Dive masters are the people that are responsible to make sure scuba divers don't drown, among other things. And other kinds of jobs as well. In fact, in 2008, which that was last year, in 2008, the president of the village and also an employee of Blue Ventures won a major international conservation award. And he won that for, let's see if I can get this right, the world's first community-run marine protected area for octopus. And he won a big award for that. And I don't know how many marine protected areas for octopus there are in the world, but there's at least one. And they apparently did a very good job at it. So just like in Pinda, there's also a lodge that the community is running and eventually will own. There's enough resources to have a variety of other social projects, environmental education projects. There's an innovative program on solar stoves. I guess it's similar to Malawi, where a lot of wood gets cut down as fuel wood. So instead of using wood, use the sun to cook it. Actually, those stoves are really pretty easy to make once you know how. I almost made one, in fact, but I just haven't quite got myself to do it yet. But with a little bit of tin foil and a piece of glass, you can make a nice solar and a sun, which most of us have. In any event, so there's quite a different variety of different kinds of benefits that come out of this program between the non-profit more tasks to go to help us figure out how to go down the path to ecotourism success. But here's some of the volunteers, scientists working in the community. But let's first ask, what is ecotourism? Because not everybody is necessarily familiar with the term. And in fact, there's a lot of terms in the marketplace that are similar to ecotourism, such as agritourism. But I don't want you to get confused with all these terms: community-based tourism, rural tourism, responsible tourism, geotourism, experiential tourism, sustainable tourism. These are just the ones that occurred to me immediately. The point is that all of these have something basic in common that they're all trying to achieve. What is it that what I just call good tourism, to combine all of this? What does good tourism basically want to do? What is it trying to achieve? Different from regular tourism, mass tourism. Help here?
My difference is the communities or environment.
Okay, to do what with the communities or environment?
Develop communities and protect or conserve or preserve the environment.
Very good, very good. Essentially then, they want to improve, or at least keep the same, improve the conditions of a community for all of its inhabitants, both the humans and the... Who else lives in communities besides people? Animals, right? And plants and all of the other organisms. So, improve the conditions of a place, of a site, for all of the inhabitants, both the humans and the non-humans. And if we succeed in doing that, then it can generate quite a few different kinds of benefits. And if you look on the handout that all of you have, in the first column on the front, where it says ecotourism at the top, it says benefits. And you can see quite a long list of environmental benefits, such that tourism can generate money to fund biodiversity conservation. Tourism offers incentives to conserve for private sector. There's many different social benefits. It increases the self-esteem of communities. Oftentimes there's resources for cultural expression, to have education programs. There's many economic benefits, such as the justification to have protected areas, or job improvement, both quantity and quality, for communities or for businesses. Now you can read through this list in detail if you like at home. I'm not going to go through all of them. But I am going to place a little bit of emphasis on time on the economic benefits. Because without economic benefits, there are no benefits at all. Since we have quite a few private sector folks here today, obviously it's no surprise to you that if it's not a successful business first, there's nothing at all for tourism. So, for those who may not have given as much thought to the ecotourism economic side, I want to use a couple different ways to describe what we want to try to do in developing good tourism economically. To do that, though, will require 3 volunteers. Now, you don't have to be too brave, because there's really not many of you to be embarrassed in front of. But I do need 3 warm bodies who will offer themselves to help me out here. What's that? Very what? What is the largest expense in transportation for a European tourist coming here?
Flights.
The flights, of course. And where are the airlines? Mostly. Someplace else. Although, of course, we see that there is still water in her hand. And you know why? That's Air Malawi. It's owned by Malawans, right? So you can see it's still there. She's doing a pretty good job. But of course, a European can't get here just on Air Malawi. They have to take another airline too. And that may be why there's so much water going into the bucket. But besides Air Malawi, there's still others that money is staying in the country for transportation. What other expenses might those be?
Accommodation.
Well, not accommodation. This is just transportation.
Car hires.
What's that?
The car hires.
Yeah, car hires, taxis, maybe even renting a horse to go to Anika, for example. So some of the money is staying here, and you've actually done a better job than I wanted you to, because Air Malawi is not that big. But very good job. You're allowed to put it in. The expenses that are in Farouk's hand represents accommodations, food and housing. You know what to do.
Yes.
I only need to explain this once.
Let me note.
Well, still doing okay. So there's this food and housing falling through his Malawian fingers. Where is that being lost to the community? Where's that money being lost to the Malawans? Where is the leakage occurring if you're coming from Europe? Ideas? Can you make it to Malawi in one day from France or Germany? No. No, what do you have to do? You have to overnight somewhere, right?
Yes.
Like usually, what's a common place to overnight? Johannesburg. I had to. And I had to pay a rather expensive hotel, in fact. So my money, your money, that I was going to spend on you guys, ended up getting stuck in South Africa. And I had to eat there too, believe that or not. So that money kind of leaked out. It didn't stay in the country. But there is still some here. And
Where did you go?
now, even if a tourist, okay, even if a tourist comes to Malawi and sleeps and eats in Malawi, we still could have leakage, as we can see from his porous hands. How could that happen? Sunbird. Is Sunbird a Malawian company?
Yes.
Oh, it is. Bad example. Is Pacific a Malawian company?
Yes.
Another bad example. Are there any companies here that are owned by foreign interests?
It's Malawi, but it's
Foreign investors, right.
So what's part?
So even if we eat and sleep in the country, the money could still be leaked out of the country. Go back to the owners someplace else.
Yes.
So obviously, for the benefit of Malawi, we want hands that are not porous. We want to try to keep as much money in the country and reduce the leakage. You may leave completely.
Thank you.
There you go. And last, and least, your name is?
Vickers.
Vickers. Yeah. Well, actually, I don't even need to give this to you. This represents the money spent on activities here in Malawi. So, let's see. So you've been watching what other people have been doing.
Yes.
Well, once again, we are losing some. I guess I put too much money in the glass. And how is it possible that activities that a tourist does here are leaked outside the country?
Trucking.
Trucking?
Yeah.
How so? This is just activities, tourist activities, going on hikes or
Safaris.
safaris. That's right. Because once again, who might own the safari companies?
Some beach sports.
Yeah, beach sports. You do have a beach.
Freshwater beach.
Yeah, so some of the tour operators may also be owned partially or completely by outsiders. Although one would think that there should be more water in Vickers' hands than stayed in these guys' hands. Well, I think you really have the best hands. No offense, gentlemen.
she's a woman.
Yeah.
There you go. All right. So what do we want to do then? How do we reduce leakage? Because we want as much money to stay in Malawian hands as possible, right? So how do we reduce the leakage that leaves the country?
Increase on local investment.
We try to increase local investment and local ownership.
Local employment.
Local employment. Exactly, as opposed to hiring outsiders.
Yes.
No, very good points. That's right, and a lot of times mass tourism organizations, companies it's not really that important to them. They're interested in just having a very good bottom line. But good tourism developers need to think about how to try and keep it as local as possible for the benefit of the country. Okay, well thank you guys very much. One round of applause for these. Now I'm going to use one other way to describe this. And for that I will need one more volunteer who's big and strong. Who's big and strong?
6.7 years.
You won't get wet, don't worry. Hands please.
Just show it first.
Okay. So here we see, and your name is sir? Jordan?
Jordan.
Jordan. It's like a country.
Sure, yeah.
You're the king, Jordan. Okay. So here you see one link here. This link is a hotel, an industry that a number of you can relate to. And hotels, this particular hotel needs to buy furniture, wooden furniture. Now the hotel has one of two choices. Well, actually, they get two choices, one of which they'll choose. They could buy their furniture from outside of Malawi by importing it, or they could buy it in Malawi. Which would be better for the country, economically speaking? Buy locally, okay. So then, the hotel buys it from, who do you buy it from? There was somebody mentioned a furniture company name yesterday. What was it? Mapanga? Mapanga.
Yes.
It wasn't that one, but that works fine for me. So let's take out one more link here. The second link is Mapanga. Now Mapanga could import the furniture, or they could buy it locally, right? Which is better economically for the country? Buy it locally. Now who would the furniture maker get the furniture from? From furniture makers, right? Or carpenters, I don't know what you call them here.
Wiko furniture.
Well, no, but somebody has to make the furniture. That they wouldn't buy furniture directly from the forest unless they use, I guess, logs as benches. Carpenters, exactly. Now the carpenter, I guess, could choose to import the wood or buy it locally.
Locally.
Okay, locally. So that's certainly better. And again, we're not thinking about environmental and social. We're just looking at the economic at the moment. So who does it buy the wood from? Or she? From who?
Zuzu.
What is that? Is that from a town?
The forest.
From a, no, you don't buy it from a forest, because the forest can't use money directly. You buy it from a timber company or a lumber company.
That's the one.
Now, I guess the lumber company could import the wood, but or they could buy it locally, and the timber company, more likely, what's best? Buy it locally, assuming it's responsible timber. Now they buy it from, I don't know if you have independent foresters, or you have, if they're employed by the timber company.
Timber company. Right.
Maybe both. Both. Well, those foresters, the guys who actually cut down, I mean, they could be Zambians, or they could be Malawans. Which would be better? Zambians or Malawans for the economic? Yes, exactly. So what we're trying to do here is we're creating a value chain. This is called a value chain. And the more links, the more steps in the production that are here in the country, the less leakage we have. So we want to make these chains as long as possible, but of course, a hotel doesn't just buy furniture, right? I mean, you buy many other things too. You buy food, and then you buy electronic equipment, and you buy many things. So what we want to do then is have quite a number of these value chains, each one as long as possible. And the more we can do that, the less leakage we have. Technically, people call this, we want to have local sourcing. And we want local sources for our people and for our materials. Okay, another round of applause for King Jordan. Thank you very much.
And why did you have to be strong?
Because it's could be a really big chain. I was going to bring a heavier chain, but then I thought I couldn't bring any clothes in my suitcase. So we'll just pretend. I mean, it was pretty sizable, wasn't it? I'll give you credit. Even where it's not due necessarily. All right. So if we can do these, we have more economic benefits, and we, as a result, could have more environmental benefits, more social benefits, more cultural benefits. And after all, that's what we're trying to do with good tourism, is generate as many of these benefits as possible. But as every business person knows, on a balance sheet, we don't just have the benefits, there are also, what's that? Liabilities, costs, or in what we'll call impacts. And if you look at your piece of paper up here in the right-hand column, it says impacts. The same categories for benefits are also the same categories for impacts. Social, cultural, economic, environmental. And again, I encourage you to go home and look at that list in more detail. Sometimes we'll even think, I didn't even think of that, like crowding as an impact on people's experience. So ultimately, good tourism tries to have many more benefits than it does impacts to justify its existence. And for some of you, that's probably very obvious, but people in mass tourism oftentimes aren't considering a lot of the different kinds of impacts. And that's one big difference between the mass tourism and the good tourism. Now, to get to these benefits, we're going to have to jump over quite a few hurdles. Some challenges that seem to pop up everywhere around the world that this kind of tourism is developed. So I'm going to share with you some of the principal challenges or principal hurdles that we need to jump over to get to the good tourism that I've unceremoniously thrown on the floor. So the first challenge is know your market, know yourself. Now, a community or a site or a country has to have touristic value before it's going to be able to have successful tourism. It sounds obvious, but very oftentimes communities or even parts of countries don't realize that they might not have a lot of touristic value because they don't realize who they're competing with. So let's just take a town here, Simba, right? There's tourism going on there. Now, who is Simba competing with at the lowest level?
I think we need to know who Simba is.
Am I saying the town wrong? Oh, let's say Zomba. Maybe I'm. No, that's not what I meant. But I just made it up. Zomba. Who does Zomba have to compete with on one level?
Malawi.
Exactly. And who else? Exactly. Have to compete with other sites in the country, locally. But if you're a tourist in Europe, chances are the first question you ask is not, which towns in Malawi am I going to go to? What's a more reasonable first question? Assuming you don't have family in Malawi. I'm going to go to Africa. Which countries should I go to? Right? And maybe they're the regional interest. Maybe they just know they want to go to Africa. So now, who is Malawi competing with? Who is Zomba competing with? Okay, so you're looking at regional countries. But who are the powerhouses in tourism in Africa? Well, you mentioned Tanzania certainly is. Kenya. Egypt. Although Egypt tends to be more cultural than natural, but and South Africa. Used to be Madagascar. So the competition is international. So we really do have to have some kind of value, touristic value, which means that we have to differentiate. Our product has to be different from the others. Now we could differentiate simply based on price, right? You know, we could, for example, you and I say, well, we have the same product. I'm going to offer it at a lower price than you. And what might you say to me?
I'll say, okay, fine.
What's that?
I'll say, okay, fine, but mine is at this price.
So that you're going to lower your price too?
No.
This is not helping my example.
Huh?
Price war. Assuming we're competing on price. But yeah, you could. But I'm going to win if you don't lower your price. Because we have the exact same product, right? So if I'm lowering my price, what might you do? Assuming, once again, it's the same product.
I know what I
You lower. And then I will lower my price, and then what will you do?
go down.
And then we will have plenty of time to go out for a drink because we'll both be unemployed. Because you go out of business. Everybody loses in a price war. Now also, we could compete, again, offering exactly the same product, not necessarily competing on price. What's probably the most common product in Africa? I'm sorry?
Game view.
Game viewing or safaris, exactly. How how many different countries can you go to see big animals? I mean, I don't expect anyone to produce a number, but quite a few, right? All the way from northern Africa to southern Africa. Now, it doesn't mean that's not a good product, but if you're entering the market, and there are already many people who are offering that, then you're way behind. So, we don't necessarily want to compete by offering the exact same products either. There are exceptions. So what we do want to try to do, and this is kind of a new concept, is we want to look for a unique story. Something that's distinctive, can be natural or cultural, about our space that's different from everybody else's, that we can then market and design. In a way, it's kind of like a book. We want to bring tourists into our book so they can interact with the characters in our story, so they can be involved in the plot and the action of our story, in the setting of our story, in the conflict, because every story has a conflict by definition. We want them to come into the book, but we do need to be careful because tourists, especially international tourists, they've read a lot of books. They know a lot of the regular stories. So that means we need to look for a more unique story. I'm going to give you a couple examples, but before we go to a couple of examples of trying to find our unique story, what do people do who don't think about story oftentimes? They oftentimes follow the belief, see if you've heard this expression before or not, if I build it, then they will come. Have you heard that? If I build a trail, if I build a birding tower, if I build a hotel, then people will come just because I built it. And that's exactly what happened to this particular park called Pico Bonito National Park in Honduras. Now, Pico Bonito Park is a great park for going whitewater rafting. They only have one location, really, where everyone puts their rafts in the water, and then they go down this principal river. To get to this put-in location, all the tour operators have to bring their visitors along one road. So Pico Bonito had a great idea. With some money from the U.S. government, they were going to build this education center. I mean, if you build it right on the road, we can basically expose or involve all the tourists with our education messages. Maybe they'll even give some donations, because they all have to go right past here. So they were excited. They built it, and on the day that it was opening, they stood on the porch, and they're going to wait for the first carload of rafting tourists. I think they can hear it now, coming down the road. There it is, there it is, there it goes. Well, they didn't stop because they don't know we're here yet. I mean, we just opened, right? Can't expect the marketing to be that good. But certainly with the next cars, they'll know because the gate now tells them that we're here. So they wait, and here comes the next car. And the next car. And then all the cars pass right by, and nobody stops. Why do you think that happened? How come nobody wanted to stop at this visitor center? They didn't know. They knew it was there because there's a big sign and stuff. Why do you think they might not stop for this? Right? Well, they didn't see too much interesting here, because if you're going rafting and you're a tourist, you're probably feeling one of a couple different emotions. You're excited, or maybe you're really fearful. Either way, those two emotions are much more powerful than stopping and looking at some posters on a wall. Besides, tour operators are very busy people. Are there any tour operators here? Nah, very busy people. You know, I appreciate that you came today, in fact. So they thought if we build it, then the people will come. And why? What was the mistake that they made? And why didn't they know? Okay, well, the right place, that's part of it. Who should they have asked? The tour operator. Yeah, they didn't ask their market. They didn't know their market, and they thought they were an attraction, and they weren't an attraction. So the end of the story is they actually took this apart and moved it to a new location. It's exactly what you just said. So that was a pretty big failure of not knowing, not having a story. There was no unique experience at all that they were trying to offer. And one thing that's very important if trying to make a transition from mass tourism to good tourism or ecotourism is that the market's changing now. And ecotourists, they don't come just to watch animals, for example. They come to get to know the people. They come to create new relationships, to be involved, to have personal connection. As a matter of fact, the owner of Hawani Lodge, which is in northern Swaziland, only an hour from Kruger National Park, he said people don't go to Kruger National Park anymore just to see the animals. Now they also want to see how people live. That's a big change from, what, 10 or 15 years ago? I mean, not everybody, of course, but as a market trend, that's very important. So people are looking for meaningful experiences, to be involved in new, distinct stories where they can have a personal connection. Last year I was in Liberia with a very similar message, and as a country, Liberia was trying to figure out how can we join the tourism world? Because as you all probably know, Liberia is coming out of a bloody civil war. So what is the unique story in Liberia? It's certainly not that they had a bloody civil war. Unfortunately, that's a fairly common story, both in Africa and other parts of the world. And they do have good animals and biodiversity watching, but as we just said, that also is not a particularly unique feature. And that was their problem. What is it? So then we started to look a little bit at their history. And then the story began to get very interesting. I don't know if any of you know the history of Liberia, so I'll tell you a piece of it. In 1848, the United States government, the northern states, they were releasing their slaves because they did not believe in slavery anymore. And as a result, they decided we should send the slaves back to Africa, where they came from. Sounds like a good gesture, right? So they chose Liberia. There were 16 tribes that were living, or still are living, in Liberia. No Europeans or anything like that. So they sent them back. Now you would think, being ex-slaves, they would have no money, right? But in fact, their pockets were full of money. Because not only the government gave them money, but there was an American colonization society, or recolonization society, something like that, which gave them money and gave them resources. And as soon as they arrived, now already thinking a little bit like Westerners, essentially they created government with the help of the US government, and they took over. They became the elite in Liberia, and the 16 tribes became the opposite of the elite, on the bottom scale. They even came up with a name for them that they still use today. Like the indigenous people of indigenous descent, tribal descent, call them something like Americos or something. I can't remember exactly. But it's slightly derogatory. In any event, this disparity, this difference between socioeconomic status, eventually, through time, led to this civil war in the 1990s, 1980s. So this is a very interesting story on a number of fronts. First off, we have perhaps the only country the United States ever sent colonists to. So for an American, that's pretty interesting because most Americans don't know that. Second, there's a lot of interesting ironies, right? You have people who are slaves, then ex-slaves, then partially enslaving the people in their new land. You have people who are free, then they lose their freedom, and then they lose the people who were there in Liberia, end up losing part of their freedom. But the story doesn't end there. Because when I went there last year, I could feel that I was in somebody else's book. Because even before I landed, as my plane was landing in the runway, there was a whole line of United Nations helicopters. Because right now in Liberia, there's a massive reconstruction program going on. There's 10,000 UN peacekeeping troops, and if you stand on the corner of the street and you just watch the cars go by, usually quite big cars, you see the American Embassy, you see USAID, you see World Vision, you see the Carter Center, you see Amnesty International. Every single major nonprofit in the world right now is dumping lots of money, I shouldn't say dumping, is investing lots of money in Liberia. So wherever you stand, you're a part of the action. Everywhere you go. I was put in a hotel next to the US Embassy. That hotel was a military hospital in the war. only several years earlier. So everywhere, every square inch is part of the war story and part of the reconstruction story. It can be a sad story, it can be a hopeful story, but in any case, it's an exciting story, no matter how you look at it. And that was a unique story, and this may be the only place in the world right now where you can go with relative security and be part of the rebuilding of a nation action. And that is a unique experience, and something that they could sell if they desired to. Now, I should also mention there's a reconciliation process going on too, very much like the way they did it in South Africa. I was in a taxi once, and they had the radio on where they were interviewing one of the ex-rebel leaders, and he was a very clever man. And they were asking him very, tough questions, and he was bouncing off the questions and making jokes, and the taxi driver right next to me was bursting out in laughter. I don't know what that means. To me, that means that the reconciliation is working. When they can make jokes about it, and they can be so open about it. I don't know how it went in South Africa. Maybe you have a better idea. So essentially then, what we want to do is we want to have stories that are meaningful and unique experiences. And that brings us to the second task, which surely won't stick to the wall either. And that is, we want to move the masses to messages. Where I use the word messages to mean those unique stories, those big, powerful ideas that make people very much involved and feel a connection to the place that they're visiting. Just for fun, I'll try to do it on the wall. Maybe your fantasy would have better tape. But anyway, not to criticize. Let's move on to the next challenge. Have patience, no shortcuts. This one is definitely going to be the most familiar to the business folks here. Anyone who's tried to work with a community, people who don't have experience in business, know that it takes a long time to get the ideas of customer service, quality control, business administration. I mean, those things take a while. For those who may not have had a direct experience, let me give you an example of how long it can take to develop those skills. For that, we're going to go to Ecuador. And we're going to go to the rainforest, the middle of the Amazon rainforest, where we find the Capawi Eco Lodge. Now, this idea was conceived by a tour company in the capital of Ecuador. Anyone know the capital of Ecuador? Anyone besides the filmmaker who was here yesterday? Well, the capital is called Quito. You call her. Yeah, Quito. Pronounced in good Spanish. So they had the idea, let's work with the Ashwar Indians who live in the rainforest. We will build a lodge, and over time we will train Ashwar Indians to take over all the different jobs within the lodge. And during that time, we will earn back our investment and a profit. At the end of that time, the lodge will be theirs. And we can still bring visitors to it, and we still make money. So they win. Everybody should win. So in 1996, they opened up the doors, and the Ashwar Indians, what kind of jobs do you think they had in that year in the hotel?
Menial jobs.
What's that?
All the menial jobs.
Yeah, they had the menial jobs, the cleaning jobs. And the hope was, from the tour company, that by the year 2008, which just ended, the entire administration of the hotel would be in the hands of the Ashwar Indians. Well, 2008 came, and as you know, it went, and the Indians had to hire a management company because there was one position they could not replace yet, which would be the chief executive, the general manager. They couldn't replace that person. So now the hope is that by 2011, the transition will be complete. So from 1996 to 2011, we're talking about a process of how many years? 15. Thank you. Sometimes I have to wait like hours before someone answers. Other times someone does the math very quickly. 15 years. And that's probably not an unusual case when you're starting out with people who don't have any experience in business. So, gotta have patience. It doesn't come quickly. Even though in mass tourism, it can come much quickly because you can import people who know how to do it. But that's not as good for having local benefits. The next challenge is we don't want to put all our eggs in one tourist basket. Tourism is a very vulnerable industry. You get a small event that's kind of bad, and people like Americans, for example, we get nervous very quick because we're not very experienced in overseas, in North America. What are some major events that have caused tourism to drop in a big way in some countries recently? What's that? Like where? In Somalia? Well, I'm not sure how much of a tourism they had before the fighting. But even this picture right here, anyone have an idea what this picture is? I guess it's hard to tell by looking at it. This is a place where there was a coup in March in Africa. What country had a coup in March? This is extremely East Africa. As a matter of fact, you have to go over the water to get to it. No, east. Madagascar. It's very east. You have to go over the water to get there. In March, they had a coup. They had a $400 million tourism industry before that coup. And now they have about nothing. As a matter of fact, I was supposed to go to Madagascar on this trip. Just so you know, I came from Swaziland last week, so that we could talk about tourism development. But I can't even go there. The U.S. Embassy won't allow me to go there yet because things still have not settled down. So they lost an incredibly large industry because of that coup. How about disease? Can anyone think of a disease in a country that have recently suffered?
Swine.
Swine. Which country has lost a lot of tourism because of swine flu? No, not Brazil. Mexico, exactly. As a matter of fact, the luxury hotels in Mexico City now have a 3% occupancy. Imagine that. And so the rest of the country, too, has suffered amazingly. How about a natural disaster? Think of a natural disaster lately? Which one? What's that? Earthquakes? Okay, where? There's one big one in 2005.
Yeah, that was funny.
Tsunami.
Yeah, the tsunami.
In India.
In India, in Thailand, especially Thailand, and some Indonesia, although I think the part that got leveled wasn't that touristic. But definitely Thailand, and Sri Lanka too, also got as well damaged. So there was a natural event. So there's many different kinds. It could be a kidnapping, it could be an assassination, it could just be a rumor. Colombia had a lot of trouble, and still does, with tourism because of the guerrillas. You know what I'm saying, right? I'm trying to think, what's the English word for that? Oh, that is the English word. In any event. So we don't want to overdevelop in just tourism at one time, where sometimes we don't have the choice. If you're a tour operator, all you do is tourism, and maybe this doesn't apply. If you're a policymaker or a community policymaker, this can be a very important choice. Okay, another challenge. Build small with local capital. And I believe local capital was even a term that you used in the activity with the water. What happens if we develop tourism in an area and it's almost completely owned by outsiders, by foreigners? How do the local people feel? Well, what ends up being their jobs? Oftentimes. Okay, let's answer this by way of example. Again, you probably can't tell which African country this is by looking at the photograph. Anyone want to try just for fun? Just for fun. It's not Malawi. It's 2 countries away from Malawi. I have to check my map. I think it's 2 countries away from Malawi. What? Ah, but not in that direction. Go west. Go west, young man. It's in Botswana. Could you tell by looking at it or just doing the math? You're doing trees. Ah, nice. Very good. So there is a... Are you making that up or is it true? You can actually use it. Okay, so there is a clue in the photo that I now am aware of. This is Botswana. This is the Okavango Delta, where 90% of the capital is European. This is a very famous example of this particular kind of tourism, where the people feel that they were sold out by the government, because they get the bad jobs, the lower jobs, I'm not saying bad jobs. They lose control over their own resources. They have a loss of dignity because of that. Some people call this internal colonization. or recolonization, because essentially the colonizers are once again Europeans, and it's an unpleasant situation. So one way to try and avoid that massive amount of leakage, of course, is to have some local ownership and some foreign ownership, or as much local ownership as possible. And then you generate many more of the benefits that we talked about in tourism. Another important thing to realize from a community's perspective, or even from maybe a tour company that wants to enter ecotourism, is that the profit margins aren't that high in tourism, ecotourism and related tourisms. And the reason's fairly simple, because to generate the most of those benefits that we talked about on your sheet, it works best at a smaller scales. Now, smaller scales, you just smaller capital investment, smaller numbers of visitors. This isn't completely true all the time, but generally they're lower profit margins. Now, if you want high profit margins, get a lot of money, build a big hotel, have a high volume, and you can still charge them a lot, and you can see those higher profit margins. I mention this because a lot of times communities think, oh, well, if we only had tourism, we could be saved. Like it was a save-all, a panacea. But it rarely is. It usually needs to be done in combination with other things. And if it's the only thing, then you run into the other challenge of having all your eggs in one basket. And then, this should be of no surprise, is that even with success comes new problems, such as conflict. Now, even in communities that seem homogeneous, where everyone is more or less the same, there's always somebody who lives closer to the road who can grab more tourists, or maybe someone who speaks German who can grab more tourists, or somebody who has a little bit more money who can invest a little bit more and get a little bit more of the tourism pie, or maybe they have political connections, and once again, that will get them more tourists as well. And when money comes in different levels of participation, sometimes jealousies occur, and problems and conflicts. So there's a couple techniques that you can use to try and reduce this. There is a guest house in the Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa called the Masakala Guest House. It's owned by 25 villages who've created a trust. So the profits from that guest house go to the trust, and instead of giving money out to you, and to you, and to you, and to all 25, the trust is charged with building infrastructure for the communities. So all the communities benefit, even though some may contribute more than others. The same in my country, where a lot of casinos are owned by Indian tribes. Now, some Indian tribes may give the profits to individual people, with whatever consequences come out of that. But I think the majority of them invest in their Indian reserves, into the tribes, and not giving money out to individuals. So that's one way of reducing conflict, if you're successful. The last challenge that I'm going to mention today is, again, a similar story, that communities that don't have a vision of what they want to create, and if they are successful, they can get run over and eaten up by tourism. This is an island in the Caribbean, very successful tourism, mass tourism island called Antigua. This is a local village, or used to be a local village. I don't know if anyone sees any local houses here anymore. They're not really there anymore. They've kind of been replaced by timeshares and condos, and the local people have been forced to move outwards to the margins. And in fact, a lot of the foreigners, more Americans than Europeans, just to give everybody a piece of the problem, they built a lot on the beaches. And you know, well, you might not know because your beaches aren't on the ocean side, but if you build on the beaches, you weaken them, and they're not as good protection against hurricanes. And usually when the natural disasters come in, those who get hurt first oftentimes are the poor people. So this is called Jolly Harbor, but for a lot of the local people, it's no longer very jolly. Well, that's, I think, enough challenges for the moment. But I want to go back to one of the challenges about the eggs in the basket. Now, if we want to be in tourism, but we don't want to put all the eggs in the basket, and this is especially relevant for Malawi, because Malawi is extremely dependent, as you know, on agriculture, and especially only a couple cash crops. This country very much needs diversification. Now, going into tourism alone is part of the diversification, Well, what if we could use tourism to expand the economic base? What if we can use tourism to create new products that no longer depend on tourism itself? It's kind of a strange notion. We will use tourism to create non-touristic products. So if there is a collapse, if there's a tsunami, no tsunamis in Malawi, if there is some other kind of disaster and tourism collapses, that some of these products will still be marketable. Let's see how that might happen. The idea behind this is called the matrix of opportunity, once again developed by a company from Inc. It's not really developed, it's like articulated. It's the idea, once you see it, it makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to go through a series of steps. The steps are all on the back of your document there, so you're certainly welcome to make notes. I'm going to use the example of our friends in Union Island, first because you're all aware of the background of that case, and second because we've tried to apply these ideas in Union Island. But certainly I encourage you to think about Malawi instead of Union Island, or if you're working in a particular site, think about that site as we go through these steps. So the first one is, referring back to the challenge we just talked about, the tourism vision and how tourism can contribute to our community vision. And again, this could be national vision. What are the quality of life indicators? What's really important for us at a community level or a national level? Is it that everybody has satellite television? Is it that we want to preserve our traditions? Is it that we want to be able to leave our doors open, our front doors open at night because no one's going to come in and rob us? In some places, security is something that they remember from their childhood and no longer have. Maybe it's to reduce the AIDS infection rate at a much lower level. Whatever it is, once we know what it is we want to accomplish, then we can try to use tourism to get there. And that's a step that's very often forgotten. We just jump right into tourism. And then we get to inventory for place attractions and stories. There's colonial history on Union Island, a lot of nice landscapes. There's a basketball player. There's a basketball player? When I was on Union Island and I heard that this guy who plays professional basketball in America in the National Basketball Association, Donald Foyle, learned to play basketball on Union Island. I had to ask somebody about that. Is that true that you have on this small little island? And the person says, yeah, actually we've got 3 NBA players, like 4 Division I college players in the United States. So if anyone knows, that's the highest level in college in the United States. And I was like, you have like 7 professional Division I players from this tiny little island? How could that be? And then the person said, oh yeah, we also win the Caribbean Basketball Championship every year. And I was like, that's amazing. How does this small little island produce these people and win all these championships? Where does that happen here? Take me to this place. And the guy goes, well, it's just a basketball court. It's not very nice to look at. And then I go to the basketball court, and for me, I thought this was like holy ground. This is sacred. This is an amazing story that they didn't even realize that they had. Maybe nobody agrees with me, but I thought that was an astounding and marketable story that Union Island could have. Something really unique among their competitors. But they never saw it. They didn't regard it as that. So anyway, just wanted to give you another example of finding the story, because this is one right here. Okay, so we've done our inventory of attractions, places, and we have some stories. Not all of them, but enough to get going. And Malawi has a lot of them. You don't need to find those. Now I want to define the visitor experience and the messages. Now, in the Caribbean, the most common experience you get as a tourist is sun and beach or sun and surf. You may have heard those expressions. You go to a resort, you hang out on the beach, you ride a motor scooter on the water, you drink your drinks. Maybe there's local people there, maybe there's a community, maybe we don't even care to see it. And a lot of those resorts are all-inclusive, so you don't even have to leave. I'm not really criticizing that choice. There's many different tourist segments, and that's as legitimate, just not what I would choose. But what Union Island might be interested in is the real Caribbean. Behind those resorts, behind those beachfront properties, there's a real culture, a real Afro-American culture, with foods and things and traditions that you won't see inside the resort. And that might be what Union Island wants to present to differentiate itself. And they're very interested in the theme of renewal, because they've lost their lagoon, or lost part of their lagoon, to that very bad half-marine development. So in your own sites, or in your own country, what is that experience? What do you want people to feel when they come here? Want them to feel awe at the basketball players? Or do you want them to feel, in Liberia, excited and fearful and hopeful because they're in the middle of the reconstruction? What is it that we want people to feel when we come to Malawi, or parts of Malawi? Okay, once we have that experience and the big idea, the story identified, then we want to start looking for products that will help generate that experience. Now, in the case of Union Island, if what we're trying to have is the real Caribbean, then maybe we want them to try some real Caribbean food. And they have a number of things like pea soup, which is very local and very popular. Tamarind balls, I don't know if you have tamarind, the fruit here. Tamarindo. Different varieties. It's kind of a bittersweet fruit. You make it into a ball, and you mix it with hot sauce and sugar, and it's sticky, and a lot of people like to eat it. It may be that you want to have certain trails that go through communities, homestays, community museums, storytellers, to get a real feel for the real Caribbean, as opposed to the mass-produced Caribbean. Once we know that, now we need to know about our visitors. We know what we want to sell. We need to know about our visitors. We need to know where they come from. This will help us determine where we're going to market. Now, in the case of this place, Union Island, it's pretty simple. They come from Miami, they land in the large island of St. Vincent, and then they take a boat to Union Island, or they land in Grenada and take another boat north to Union Island. So we know more or less what kind of visitors and where they come from. Now we have enough to develop our marketing strategy. We know what the product that we want is, we know about our audiences, we know the experiences that they want, so we can do this at this point. The different experiences. Alright, so now that we're in the marketing, we're about to do the third step. And the third step is we bring the markets to the merchandise. In the marketing strategy, we want people to come and experience and test out the local products that we have in the site. So that leaves us just one more, I'm going to try it. That leaves us just one more task, which is shortly coming. Now, assuming we've begun doing this, now we can add more goods, more destinations, and more services to our menu so that the way there's more participation. We're not just thinking about one small site. And here, something interesting is happening. We're in a way, we're now using our country, or our site, as a scientific laboratory. And what we're testing are these different destinations and products and services. And we're testing them on different kinds of visitors that come down and try these products. Now what you see here, these two people, they're farming a new product in Union Island called sea moss, which is good for soup, but it's even better for aphrodisiacs. Does everyone know what an aphrodisiac is? An aphrodisiac is a chemical that you add to food to get you sexually aroused, or to get someone else sexually aroused for you if you put it in their food. So this is a common use for this product, and then we might want to see, well, which tourists like to use sea moss as an aphrodisiac? And as they're going about testing, then they're now able to develop tourism, experiential tourism, as an identity builder. This is where they build a brand. Okay, everybody watch closely. So Ashen Lagoon, a land coming back. The brand that Union Island might want to do is this renewal. Maybe they literally try and get rid of the marina, or at least through their branding and through their product. What is branding? Well, obviously it involves a logo and a slogan and a series of related feelings that you get. For example, think of Jamaica, right? Now people in the United States know the brand of Jamaica. Even if they've never been there, they think, Jamaica man, drinking rum and laying on the beach, having a good time. You know, they think they know these positive qualities, and they've never even been to Jamaica. That's because it's a strong brand. And Kenya is a very strong brand for wildlife viewing. South Africa has a strong brand as a country. Does Malawi yet?
Yes.
Yes? Yes? I know what the slogan is. Okay, and the people here are very nice. No question about that. So here we're ready to put on the logo. And now, the next step is where the magic happens. The next step is where we've been going for most of this presentation. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Here we go. Watch. Now Union Island can take products that they've tested in the laboratory, and now they've added the brand and the logo to these products, and now they can export these products, export them to various countries around the world. And while they're exporting these programs, if there is a disaster and tourism collapses in Union Island, assuming it's not a world economic collapse, they can continue to export these products. Now, I don't know personally how involved tourists were in popularizing this, but I do now know that this is exported. And funny, it's got a small plastic bottle. Was this sold in bigger glass bottles at some point in the past? Maybe they just skipped that whole step. Do you say yes? And you said no. So maybe in some places. But anyway.
Why did you start in glass?
What's that?
When they started.
They started it. It started as a glass bottle.
Yes.
Okay. Well, yeah, here you go. It's plastic. So these are products, and there are other products. Costa Rican coffee. I don't know if the tea here. Jamaican rum. Again, these are products that through tourism and through the experience of tourism in those countries, the product has sort of absorbed that experience through their brand and now can be sold abroad. And now we've essentially involved more people in economic activity thanks to tourism, but who do not depend directly on tourism. And that's one way we're trying to use tourism to move beyond tourism. So essentially, ecotourism is not for everyone, but for those who want to try and those who pay attention to the different challenges and the different steps in the matrix have a better possibility of finding the path to the benefits rather than finding the path to failure, the economic benefits, the social benefits, the cultural benefits. And by having these benefits more widely distributed through the different communities, then there's less likely the possibility that this tourism will be controlled by the rich and the wealthy and the foreigners, and it will generate more participation by people in Malawi. So I want to wish good luck to the people of Union Island and wish good luck to the people of Malawi. Thank you very much. Before we break, I want to leave you with some final questions. These questions are on your sheet here. First, what does your community, country, site want to be in 10 or 20 years? What will be their quality of life indicators? And what do Malawians aspire to? And how can tourism be used to achieve that? What makes your community, country, site unique in Malawi or unique in Africa? What other local products could benefit from the arrival of many new customers? I personally think there is another product that has great international potential called Mbewa. Don't you think that would be a great, put it in a nice little box with a bow and send it to the United States? Warm heart of Africa, and a warm head, and a warm tail. Anyway, that might need a little more work. How can the local community use tourism as part of an overall sustainability or restoration strategy? In the case of Union Island, they wanted to restore. In the case of Malawi, maybe it's sustain what we have now. Two different strategies, but related. I want to certainly let you all know that even though I won't be here that long, I want to make myself available to you. The best way I probably can is if there's information or resources or ideas that you're trying to access. There's many things on the internet, in the world that I know about, that I might be able to help link you up with. So I certainly encourage anyone to send me an email asking for information or opinions or ideas. On my website I have quite a few articles about tourism, ecotourism, heritage interpretation, training guides, managing visitors in parks. So that's kind of my specialty, is how do we manage visitors in protected areas, and how do we, and of course tourism is part of that. So with that, I'd like to now suggest taking a few minutes to get some biscuits and some tea and coffee. If people have to leave right now, that's completely understandable. For those who don't have to leave, we can spend a little time when we come back with the biscuits and the coffee, and comments, suggestions, anything you want to talk about. Leave that open. So feel free, I think it's all ready.
Thank you.